there
for
a wreath for Christmas.
That's unacceptable. That needs to come down immediately, beginning of January.
Why is that? Why does that bother you? What if somebody likes a wreath on their
door? Well, it doesn't bother
me.
I'm just, you asked my opinion, I gave it.
If you looked angry. I
didn't
look at you, but I assume. Typically, when an employer makes a fundamental change to an employee's terms and conditions of employment, there are effectively two options. Option number one is the employee says, yeah, I'm good with it. So you have acceptance. Right? Or option number two is the employee says, no, I don't like it. And if the employer maintains that position, then the employee typically would resign and effectively sue for constructive dismissal, which is you fundamentally changed my deal. I didn't agree to it. You've constructively dismissed me. I want severance. Okay. But is there kind of a third scenario? And there is a third scenario where the employee in effect says nothing. So time marches on. The employee continues to be employed and work pursuant to the new terms and conditions and says nothing. So at some point, the employer's position on that is, employee, you've condoned it. In effect, you've acquiesced to the change that we've made to your terms and conditions of employment. The problem with employer reliance on condonation, though, is it's very difficult to assess in any given circumstance. And by way of example, so you have a case in the Ontario court system where you have a large multinational employer buys up a small family business. The daughter of the owner of the family business is offered employment with the multinational. The multinational says to her, here are your terms and conditions of employment, and oh, by the way, included is a bonus. Now, it turns out that bonus is a very healthy bonus. And so the acquiring multinational realizes about a month into her employment that it's very generous. In fact, it was worked out to about 3 times her base salary.
Nice bonus.
Nice bonus. Don't even think about it. And so the employer says, okay, no. Sorry, oops. We're not going to give you the bonus, but for the following year, you'll probably participate in the bonus. What does she do? Nothing. She continues to work. And then about 10, 11 months later, she actually issues her notice of resignation. That's effective about 3 months later. Still has said nothing. But immediately following the notice of resignation, or shortly thereafter, she negotiates certain terms of her employment, including retroactive base salary payments, car allowance, says nothing about the bonus. Nothing. So after she effectively resigns, she brings a lawsuit for constructive dismissal, saying, you didn't pay me my bonus, you owe me my bonus. The employer says, huh? You can't lay in the bulrushes for about a 14-month period, all of a sudden pop out and say, hey, I want my bonus now. You acquiesced or you condoned it. This case actually found its way to the Court of Appeal in Ontario, and ultimately the Court of Appeal essentially shrugged their shoulders and went, you're a big employer, you operate in 49 countries. She's a young employee. Come on, pay her the bonus. Yeah, but she condoned it. Condone it, shimon it. That was essentially the attitude of the Court of Appeal. And so they said, yeah, you got to pay her the bonus. Contrast that with a second decision in Ontario where you have Saussure, which is the restaurant, I think it's now called Lee, for any of you avid restaurateur fans. It was an employee that had been working there, and because they were relocating, they issued a notice of layoff to this particular employee who worked in the dining area. And with every intention of recalling the employee. What happens? They recalled the employee about 12 weeks later after the notice of layoff was issued. Does the employee say anything about the notice of layoff? No. Why could the employee have said something? Well, unless you have a contractual term that permits you to lay off as an employer. By laying off an employee, you're fundamentally changing the deal. That's a constructive dismissal. But what does the employee say? Nothing. Comes back to work, continues to work. A week later, though, after the recall, sends a lawyer's letter and says, I've been constructively dismissed, but continues to work. So continues to work. 6 months later, issues a claim. After that, and by the way, at the time of trial for this, was still working there at the restaurant. So what does the employer say? The employer says, well, hold it a second. Yes, you're right. We can't lay you off. That's a constructive dismissal. But you condoned it. You hung around, continued to work, accepted the notice of recall, and the fact that you sent a lawyer's letter, that's not enough. That's not enough. And 6 months after that, you issued a claim. Sorry, it's too late. What you did was acquiesce or condone the employer's fundamental change in your terms and conditions of employment by laying you off. So yes, condonation, this idea of an employee acquiescing to a fundamental change, exists notionally, but its application is very, very unpredictable. You almost said it was cool to sack.
Maybe I did. To be cool. That's what the cool kids say.
Who do you think is actually cooler, you or me?